So Solomon rather, had this idea about, in his observations, that there was a kind of a balance that God had put into the world. One observation was the oppression of the poor. He says that when you see the oppression of the poor, don't be too surprised. In fact, this could be good for a land, for this to happen. Now, that sounds like an odd conclusion, but he doesn't end there. He says the king needs the fields cultivated. And really, in short, what he's saying here is we're all in the same boat. Some of us may be in a higher strata of society than somebody else, but societies still depend on every part of the functioning social order. And without that, things can fall apart very quickly. Where I work, you have to wait in long lines to go places sometimes. It's a giant airport. And you'll occasionally see people cut line. And it gets when someone witnesses them do that, other people start cutting line too. And there's been times where I've like sat there and thought, is a possibility that we're just not going to have a line after a while. I mean, it's very interesting, and I just watch this, unfold sometimes, and I'm like, if somebody's waiting needs to get to work and they take their spot on the bus, on the tram they call it. Why do we do what we do? It leads to some basic questions about this, and Solomon's basically saying, look, I mean, he says there's those who are oppressing have people above them and people above them and people above them. Now, he could be saying that they also are being oppressed. But what I think he might be hinting at here is that if things don't get done at the bottom, when it arrives at the king, he's going to come down on everybody. And additionally, you have, like in the Psalms, where it says, God is the God who puts kings in chains. And so above them all stands God. Now, in Jesus' time, the tax collectors were reviled. Why were they reviled? Well, they were reviled because they probably were oppressing the poor. They were taking a little off the top for themselves. So if they were told, collect, we'll say 30% from everywhere you go, they may have collected 35 or 40% and pocketed the rest. And this, of course, made them thieves and, understandably made people mad. But interesting, Jesus was forgiving these people, and they were just like shocked by this. But had they known the wisdom of the Old Testament, they would have seen that God is involved in all of these things, okay? Now, he moves on and he goes into a really interesting story about wealth. And he says the problem with wealth is that the more you accrue of it, the more what are you going to do with that wealth? Where are you going to purchase things? Well, what are you going to purchase? And you need food. He says, well, are you going to purchase more food? I'm, of course, paraphrasing here. And he says, if you purchase enough food, eventually it's just going to go bad. So he says, other people are going to eat it. So what are you going to do? Watch other people eat the food that you paid for? And he says, the more wealth you basically get, the more that's sort of quote unquote out of your hands. It's out of your hands. And so he says, chasing after wealth is vain. He's like, because what you're going to end up with is just accruing more wealth. And as you accrue more wealth, what's next? Accrue more wealth. It's a dead end. It just keeps going and going and going. And I thought it was pretty interesting as I was reading this passage. And then he tells this story. He says there was this rich man, and he went on a bad venture. He invested his money, basically, and he failed. Lost all his money, and he had a son, and he couldn't leave an inheritance to a son. And he said for the rest of his days, he was bitter. I'm paraphrasing all of this. You have to read this for yourself. This is Ecclesiastes, I think the latter part of 5. And so he says, this man spent the rest of his days kind of bitter. Now, this is interesting, because I think what he's saying here is he gained all this wealth, and now after he has the wealth, he has something to lose. So he goes from, there's a downside to this great wealth, that there's also this could be lost. And then the guy's perspective was completely off. He felt that he had lost something great. because he invested in something that's of this world. So he concludes this, and this is a hint to where he's going to end up here. He says, what it would benefit a man the most is to enjoy what God has put into his life. Enjoy the food he's put into his life, and enjoy the toil he's put into his life. He said he'll barely remember his life because he'll have so much joy. Now think about that. He's saying, find joy in what God has given you. Now, is this a statement against upward mobility? There's people out there that might say this is a slippery slope. I don't believe so. I think that Solomon would have no problem with the observation that someone tries to improve their lot in life. That's not the issue. The issue here is this, that when you make life, the meaning of life, about these pursuits, that's the meaning of life, that's when you're going to find emptiness, and you're going to find a bunch of traps that are waiting for you, and you're going to find yourself in a meaningless life. And so he says, just enjoy these things that God gave you, and find your meaning in what God is doing. And that could not be more in line with Jesus's teachings. It just couldn't be more in line. You just see this all over his teachings, that someone wants to follow him, he says, give your wealth away. Now, was he preferring that the guy be poor? Did he say you have to be poor to be a follower of Jesus? No. He's saying you can't make your life about this world. Anyone who loses his life will gain his life, is what Jesus said. And that's what he was hinting at here, was everything about this world that you would make your life about, you have to lose that to gain the joy that God really wants to give you. And you can have it in this life with a relationship with him through his son. All right. Like and subscribe. Have a good one.